We are today going to do a little, I said we'd start Sartre, and I decided to amend that plan slightly. We'll start Sartre soon, but not quite today. But I'd like to talk a little bit just about existentialism itself. I mentioned the other day that if you look at 20th century philosophy, it's basically in two streams. And those two streams are, Joe, existentialism and the one I found boring. That's probably why you don't remember it. Jacob, it was
linguistic analysis.
Linguistic analysis, or sometimes called analytical philosophy. It reduces philosophy simply to an examination of communication. What is communication? What are words? And that whole investigation, in my mind, really reduces philosophy to a microscopic piece of what it's supposed to be, But that's been a fairly dominant philosophical tradition in the 20th century. The other one, much more robust, not much more hopeful, but it's the one that I find more interesting at least, and this is called existentialism, which has its roots in earlier phenomenology. And I did a very brief treatment of phenomenology in connection with Husserl. You may recall, and I said that really that's the stream that makes it into the 20th century. When we think about, where did existentialism come from? There's been a lot of sources that have been suggested, but most people would say it's either from Nietzsche or from Kierkegaard or from both. Kierkegaard kind of representing a more theistic Christian form of existentialism, Nietzsche a more atheistic form, and in some ways you'd say both of them merge and produce something of 20th century existentialism. Hard to say what it is. The very phrase, or the very suffix, ism, implies some kind of system of thought. Marxism is a system of thought. Hegelianism is a system of thought. Existentialism is not very systematic. And so some people would say there really is no such thing as existentialism because it's just this kind of collage of strange streams of thought and so on, and yet we can't really systematize it very well. But it does dominate a great deal of 20th century thought, so we'll try our best. Some names that have been suggested. I mentioned Kierkegaard. Nietzsche would be the top two. Beyond that, there have been others that have been nominated for the job, including Shakespeare. Because Shakespeare does, at certain points in some of his plays, express rather graphically and dramatically the existential spirit. Any ideas? There's one little kind of piece of Shakespearean literature that is probably the most famous for reflecting the existential spirit. You've all heard it, and it is, go ahead.
Is it to be or not to be?
That is a good one. That certainly is a good nomination. It's not the one I have in mind, but it would be right on the top of the list. There's another one I had in mind. Jake, was that what you're going to say? How about, listen to this one. A poor player struts his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. Life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. That's pretty good existentialism. Most existentialists, especially those in the atheistic tradition would find in that a pretty good expression of the spirit of it. Another name you'll sometimes hear is Dostoevsky. Fyodor. And his most famous book, which is entitled, I think, he's got several very famous books, so this may be debatable, but I think his best known, most famous would be, buddy? Do you know? Sydney? No? Trevor?
It's either Crime and Punishment or the Brothers Karamazov.
I'd say it's the Brothers Karamazov, but you certainly, that's what I was thinking, you could argue either one, you know. Both of them developed Dostoevsky's themes, and existentialism has certainly been identified as a major component of that. The whole romantic movement in literature. The romantic movement comes when in history? Where would you put the romantic movement in literature in terms of the broad philosophical currents of history? Where does that fit in? Well, good morning. Great, you could make it. Are you tardy? Do we need to nail you?
I signed in at the office.
Ah.
So,
I see.
I'm just great.
So it's legitimate.
Yes, it's legitimate.
I'll accept that. Where does the romantic movement fit in? Anybody, you guys that are literature, buffs, where do you put the romantic movement? What is the romantic movement? What is it? Pardon me? Smoochy stuff. See, and that's the answer I get to the question, what's the romantic movement? I'm not happy. Mr. Palpin is not happy. Sydney.
It's the movement in literature that focused a lot on nature and kind of escaping into that world, and idealistic kind of idea.
It is kind of idealistic in a certain sense. Escaping to nature, yes, certainly does that. Who are names associated with the romantic movement? Yeah.
John Donne, maybe?
Is John Donne romantic? I'm not so sure. Who? Yeah? Van Hawthorne, maybe? Yeah. Certainly. Go ahead.
Herman Melville.
Herman Melville, especially among American authors. And what you find in it, romantic movement is sort of a reaction to, get this is good, kind of get this in your head, it's a reaction to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment celebrated the achievements of human reason. Reason is going to do it all for us, And after a while, people began to become a little bit disenchanted with whether reason is going to actually solve every human problem. And because there's part of the human experience that is certainly not rational. It's emotional. It's romantic. And in a sense, the romantic movement is the pendulum swinging back a little bit away from this hyper focus on reason. Many of the elements in the romantic movement, especially even Moby Dick, play out somewhat existential ideas. Jacob, was that a hand up or did you just, okay. Some people would go clear back to Augustine. Augustine, because of his intensely introspective approach to things. Until Augustine in Christian history, everything was more or less objective. It was rather formulaic. Christ is two natures, one person, so on. Kind of have these theological categories that are spelled out. Augustine's the first guy that comes along and begins to explore the inward life. What's going on inside the human heart, not so much what's outside in a theological, expression of our faith, but what's the inner experience. And he's so intense in examining the inner life that it begins to sound a little bit like an existentialist, because they have something of that going on. Others have gone back to Plotinus. with his sort of mysticism. And maybe the name that, in terms of the pre-Socratics, who do you suppose would be the first name that would pop to the list is the great ancient pre-Socratic existentialist? Probably it would be everybody knows it is, of course, Avery. Is that an answer?
Harmony.
Oh, man. Mamma mia. Matthew? I think Heraclitus is probably a little bit more readily make his way to the top of the list. Remember, Heraclitus, the only thing we can bank on is there's nothing we can bank on. It's change, it's flux. You never step into the same river twice. It's the whole problem of time, the clock ticking, that whole thing. Those are very existential ideas. So, for my money, if you force me to say where did existentialism really start, I would probably put it at the feet of Kant. Kant was not an existentialist by any means, but he does set up the philosophical paradigm that gives rise to existentialism, because he gives us the distinction between noumenal and phenomenal and tells you can't get to the noumenal. And existentialism despairs of the noumenal and tries to build life out of the phenomena. That's why the phenomenological movement in philosophy produces it. And so if I'm going to trace it down, historically I'd say we start with Kant. He'd be unhappy to hear that. He didn't want to produce existentialism, for sure. But I think his wall became the philosophical basis upon which you get existentialism. All right, so a little bit of a historical. What are some of the underlying characteristics? I'm going to give you two lists here. I'm sorry, it's the only way I know to do this. These I'm calling basic characteristics, basic features. And at this point, I'm giving you features that I would say represent more philosophical propositions about existentialism. The first one would be existence precedes essence. Who would be, what would be the name of a philosopher that would take just the opposite view, that would not be an existentialist, but would be an essentialist, that would say essence precedes existence? There'd be numbers of names you could mention. Anyone in particular might be Alicia. Who would be an essentialist of history?
I have no idea.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that at this late stage in the game. Who would it be, Ben?
Plato.
Certainly, Plato. Who else? You name any name that would come in the list with Plato would be Avery. Who would be an essentialist?
Parmenides.
Parmenides is good, thank you. Who else would be an essentialist in history? The essence precedes existence, Josiah? Descartes. Those would be the top three. So those are all excellent answers. They would all be essentialists. Existentialists would be the people on the other side, more empirically oriented, but Sartre is the one who actually states this as a philosophical creed. Existence precedes essence. And when we talk about Sartre, we'll come back to this, but you see, Sartre doesn't want to be called, a man before he wants to be called Jean Paul. He is Jean Paul before he's a man. If you say, there's a man whose name is Jean Paul, then you've said there's essence, namely man, that precedes existence, namely Jean Paul. No. He wants you to take him as whatever he is first. He is Jean Paul Sartre. And don't put a label on him. Any label. He is what he is. You see, that's existence. And then what he may be categorized as is of secondary importance. He doesn't want to be trapped in some kind of box that says, well, you're this, therefore you must behave this way or be this sort of thing, you know. Existence precedes all of that, yeah.
So is this saying precedes like in terms of importance or chronologically?
Well, logically, more than anything, saying before you think about this at all, you take something in terms of what it actually is in its raw existence. And it's not chronological in any sense that's meaningful. It's just that it takes logical priority. That's Adam House. Secondly, existentialism favors the particular over the universal. Similar idea. In terms of our discussions in here, nominalism over idealism. Okay. Nominalism is favored over idealism. Idealism is closely related to essentialism, the universal chair, the universal ethic. All of that is secondary. You might say it favors species over genus for the biology people in the room. The specific over the general. You know. It favors, thirdly, the concrete over the abstract. Existentialism doesn't like abstractions, generalizations, broad platitudes about things. It's really focused on specific, concrete expressions of whatever is being expressed. Favors the subjective over the objective. Avery.
How do 3 and 4 not mess with each other? Because like concrete is definitely tends towards objective truth.
How can I put that? Concrete in this sense means specific things in this world of a, how can I put it? Concrete, I'm using concrete in a metaphorical sense here. So I could talk about your concrete subjective experience, okay? And the emphasis in a phrase like that would be your immediate, particular experience of this classroom at this moment, at this time. That's concrete. We're not generalizing to some sort of, kind of broad abstraction of what classrooms are like. In the great scheme of things, it's your specific, immediate, concrete experience right here, right now. I mean concrete in that sense. And that, in that sense, is very subjective. It's what's happening with Abraham right now. Your concrete moment of experience here and now. That's concrete, If you were to say, okay, I'm having this concrete experience right now in this classroom, and I'm going to generalize to classrooms of the world and students of the world and teachers of the world and kind of give these generalized ideas about what should happen in classrooms in the great scheme of things, that's moving toward abstraction. And it's not concrete anymore. So it's in that sense. It's very similar to the particular and universal. These are all kind of similar ideas. That makes sense. Good question. I'm glad you asked that. Was there a... Same question? Okay, good. Great. All right. I think there's a fair amount of this that has seeped into, to some degree, Christian understanding. I'm not saying this to be judgmental or pejorative, but this always reminds me of one of the little catchy tunes that I grew up on in my Baptist church, way back when I was a kid, your age, younger. And it was one of these Fanny Crosby, tunes. She liked to write catchy little hymns. And this one, I think I've mentioned this to you before, but it's a hymn we would sing called "He Lives." You ever sung that? Right? Did I talk about this once in here? Do you remember this? You know the song though, right, Sarah? I serve a risen Savior. He's in the world today. It's got a nice kind of catchy flow to it. And so on. Fanny Crosby liked to write hymns that sort of took over the barroom tunes of the day. That's why she was so controversial in her day. In her day, she would take these what were viewed as sort of really undignified tunes and put Christian words to them, and it was rather scandalous to some people. But they caught on, and I grew up on that genre of hymnody. So anyway, this particular one, I serve a risen Savior. He's in the world today. Is that? Think whatever men may say. I see. And then the chorus, just announces with great kind of triumphant sort of confidence, He lives, Christ Jesus lives today. He walks with me and talks with me along less narrow way. He lives. And then the whole song ends in the context of apologetics. You guys taking apologetics, you might want to keep this in mind. It's a powerful argument because it asks the question right at the conclusion of it. How does it go?
You ask me how I know He lives.
There you are. See, it's a question. You ask me how I know He lives. This is envisioning a conversation with a skeptic. You've been whistling your tune, walking down the sidewalk, some skeptic grabs you and says, well, how do you know that He lives? There's the question. And so, you've been now steeped in your big deal apologetics. So the answer that the hymn tells you to give is, Sarah?
He lives within my heart.
There you go. That's how I know He lives. He lives in my heart. How do you like that? The skeptic is sitting there, got his finger on your nose, say, wait a minute, you're telling me that Jesus of Nazareth lives? I thought He died. I thought He died under Pontius Pilate. I think His dead body is still over there somewhere. And how do you know He lives? He lives in my heart. Oh, well, that's fine. That's all you mean. No problem there. That's great. You got a nice memory of Jesus. Got a nice thought about Jesus living in your heart. Fine. No argument. You see. That'd be an example of a kind of subjective, concrete expression. I'm not sure how much freight it moves out there in the world of actual persuasion to the truth of the Christian faith. It's, may have some value in personal testimonial. I don't think that's what Paul would say. What would Paul say to that question? You ask me how I know He lives, what would Paul say? He lives in my heart. Is that Paul's answer? What is his answer? Jordan? Remember his answer? It's kind of a broad question. It may be a little unfair, but just take a guess. What would you guess would be Paul's answer to the question? The skeptic says to him, "How do you know He lives?" Time's up, Laura. How do you know He lives? What would Paul say to that? Good heavens. Alicia, what would Paul say to that? I saw Him. That's a little different from He lives in my heart, isn't it? That's like eyewitness testimony. Paul would say, well, He rose again the third day. He was seen by Cephas, then by the 12, then by more than 500, some of whom are still alive to this day. You can go check it out with yourselves. I saw Him because I was on the Damascus road, and this is not just lives in my heart stuff. This lives in objective reality. This is actually, Paul's more interested that he's living outside his heart for the purpose of apologetics, you see. Because that means he's living out there where everybody else can determine and discover Him as well. Well, existentialism really goes in the direction of this inward, subjective understanding of truth. And it does take the heat off. If all I'm saying to the world is, hey, Jesus lives in my heart, well, no argument with that. Somebody else says, well, Buddha lives in my heart. Well, I got Mohammed in my heart. Cool, you know. We all have somebody nice in our hearts. Wonderful. Is anybody out there at home in the universe? That's the question, you know. And we've gotten a lot of this sort of existential flavor in 20th century Christianity. Not just here. I'm just picking on this little hymn. It's actually kind of a cool hymn. But more the flavor. You know, how much of the hymnody, the popular hymnody of the church right now celebrates experience rather than celebrating the majesty of a holy God. You know, I have to say, even in my own church, I'm appalled at how much the music is, oh, Jesus, you make me happy. I'm so happy, happy, happy. Like, come on, what is this? What is this, worship? You know, I mean, I can... You know, you see what I'm saying? The focus has become subjective, concrete, particular, and my existence is center stage. Rather than some kind of idea of a universal truth like Jesus reigns over the universe and there's a reality out there. You see the difference? Emphasis on personal involvement. Kierkegaard, of course, emphasized this, and in his day, it was an emphasis that needed to be made. I want you to realize the pendulum can indeed swing to the other extreme, you know. In Kierkegaard's day, everybody could recite the Nicene Creed. Everybody could, you know, show up in church on Sunday morning, say the prayers, sing the hymns, go home. It didn't make a bit of difference in their lives. This was just the routine of decent 19th century European culture. And Kierkegaard screamed, foul ball, you know. There's got to be something personal here for this to be meaningful. So I think Kierkegaard in his day was giving a very lively critique that needed to be heard. Unfortunately, we can take that critique to the other extreme, and then we wind out with this, you know, with nobody can recite the Nicene Creed, nobody knows their theology, but they sure feel good. You know, that's a little problem too, you know. So he wants both. He wants some kind of balance. Favors the relative over the absolute. Anytime you hear someone say the non sequitur, there are no absolutes, then you can tip your hat to existentialism. That has been the inheritance, the legacy of existentialism in our culture. All right, so those are kind of philosophical characteristics of your culture. Postmodernism, which is the term usually applied to the philosophy of your culture, is just the kind of aftermath of this existential flavor that came earlier, you know, but they're very much related. All right, comments about this? I want to give you a separate list now. Which is not philosophical themes, but more, and I'm not quite sure what to call this list because I mean something different by it. I'll just put it this way, more popular expressions of it. Let's put it that way. Expressions. So if you ask what is existentialism philosophically, you would think about some of these terms. And these hopefully are philosophical terms that are meaningful to you by this time. First theme, or first expression of it is back to this word. Pronounced, Stephen.
It's pronounced ox.
Thank you. You, my son, are a rare genius. That was probably the whole entrance test you had to go through for Duke, wasn't it? They just said, sit down and pronounce this word. Stephen hits it out of the park. He's in. Angst, which means, Ben?
It means anxiety.
Anxiety. Popularized by what philosopher?
That's one of those questions you know the answer to in
Matthew, by
Heidegger.
Heidegger. And when he talks about angst, anxiety, he distinguishes it from fear. Based on what, Sydney? What's the difference between angst and just simple fear?
Angst is always present. It's just this constant level of anxiety, and fear is like a more immediate rationalization of something in front of me.
Yeah, I don't know the word rationalization is what you need there, but yeah, you're smoking in the...
Yeah.
Mr. Williams walks around the corner. That's fear. Angst is not so well defined. It's when you're not doing anything wrong, everything's fine, but you still have this uneasy sense of anxiety just about things in general, and you can't put your finger on it. We talked about that just within the last day or two. So that is a theme, that is an expression. I want to be cautious. These may be philosophical themes, these are more kind of expressions of it. So try to keep that distinction. There is an anxiety. The existentialist feels anxiety about just existing, about just being here. Yeah.
Why does he have that angst about
Because
existing?
he is in a state of thrownness. Were you here for that, Alicia? Our discussion of Heidegger? Thrownness. Trevor, what is this thrownness idea that gives rise to angst?
I'm assuming me, because you're looking at me. So
That's right, I am looking here, thank you. Yeah.
Thrownness, according to Heidegger, is kind of the feeling that you get when you're thrown out of a plane, and then you're actually in a coma for partway down, and then you wake up from the coma, and then you're going, oh, look, I'm going to die. And that's about it.
That's about it, yeah. Yeah, that's thrownness.
That feeling.
That feeling. We've all been there, you know. It's that uneasy feeling that you've just awakened, you have complete amnesia, and you are not sure how you got into this predicament, but you are plummeting toward death. That, Alicia, creates a certain degree of anxiety. You know. It's not fear of any particular thing, but is a generalized fear related to your impending non-existence. Another expression of this, solitude. Existentialism is a lonely philosophy. Where would you find this loneliness, for example, Trevor? In Nietzsche, what would be the most obvious expression of the solitude theme in Nietzsche?
I think that was in his Overman. He said that he was very alone because he separated himself and rose above people. So.
Exactly. The Übermensch, thus spoke Zarathustra, rise above the herd. Well, that's a lonely place to be, you know. The herd is a place of community, mutual support. I can reinforce my strength by joining my weak existence with Joe's weak existence. And together, we in the herd can have some sense of security. But the truly courageous rise above the herd in this lonely, isolated place. Abraham is alone when he's going up on the mountain with his son. Kierkegaard focuses on fear and trembling. That's a lonely place. Either or. It's a lonely decision. You know, teleological suspension of the ethical. It's a lonely place. Nobody gets it. Right? Freedom. Existentialism is passionately concerned about freedom. It's probably the single most consistently recurring theme in existentialism. The popular expression of it in your culture that actually originated with my generation when I was your age. 4 words. You know, 4 words I'm after? It's the best known popular expression of the existential theme of freedom. The 4 words are run for your life.
Raise your hand, Sidney. No, it's not right.
Huh?
So
Anybody? Kayla? Do your own thing. Do your own thing. Existentialism says if it feels good, do it. I don't know if you've heard that one. Have you heard that one? Or is that... that's what I heard in my culture. If it feels good, do it. Freedom. Yeah. Very important emphasis on death. Existentialism is concerned about existence and your impending loss of your existence. The fact that your days are numbered and that on the other side is just darkness. Hamlet's soliloquy comes to mind here, Jacob. To be or not to be. That's often viewed as an existential comment. What's on the other side? I don't know. Yeah.
How would Kierkegaard then, if Kierkegaard, I mean, he was a Christian, so he believed that we'll be in heaven, so he didn't necessarily believe that there's just darkness on the other side.
No, but he did, see, unlike, if I don't want to cut off your question, have you formulated your question such that I can...
My question is, how would Kierkegaard...
Kierkegaard, even he, has this a kind of a great uncertainty, a great risk. The term that's sometimes associated with Kierkegaard is the leap of faith, or a leap into the abyss. Now, he believes God is there, but he believes God is there as a sort of act of faith in the face of the evidence, you know. So there's still kind of a lonely risk involved with it. He says we must do that because, as a matter of faith, we do believe God is there and will catch us at the bottom of that abyss. But there is still that abyss, and there is still the leap. I think he probably overstates that more than classical Christianity would. But in all forms of Christianity, there is that point where you actually entrust yourself to this gospel. You know? So that, he plays on that, yeah.
Can I pass out the...
Oh, yes, you may. We have... Sydney has arrived at... nearly old age here. Another expression, meaninglessness. Life is meaningless. Very popular song that I recall, Mr. Williams recalls. What's it all about?
Alfie?
Alfie. What's it all about? You listen to those words carefully, and it's an existential question. What's it all about? Does anybody even recognize that title? You probably don't. None of you have heard of that, have you? I know. What's it all about? Alfie. Well, I won't bother. It's not as good as He Lives, so. Meaningless is in the 60s, Westerns look different. You know, Westerns in the 40s and the 50s, the good guys always wore what?
White.
White hats. That's how you knew in a movie who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. I'm going to keep talking in spite of the fact that you're utterly distracted by these donuts that are being... Yeah. When you get to the 60s, which is still way before your time, something happened. Oh, those look good. Oh, I'm going to pass. Thank you. I am. Yeah. All right, here I am up here. Yeah. What happens in the 60s? Does anybody know? You wouldn't know this from experience. I would recall it. Avery?
I think there was a pretty apparent blend of good and bad.
Yeah,
So the
yeah.
good guys might kind of
Yeah.
do some hippie
Yeah.
actions.
You began to see a change in the Western genre, that there were no clear-cut good guys or bad guys. The good guys had a dark side. The bad guys had some redeeming virtues, and life became a lot more complicated, in a sense. The cultural expression of existentialism has followed a certain track. Beginning in post-World War Europe, and probably the most famous name is Sartre, who we're going to start with tomorrow. And Sartre really does embody a lot of the flavor of what I've talked about here. It comes over to America in the early 50s. This is post-World War. But it comes to America in a little bit more of an upbeat form. That's a very important thing to understand. Existentialism in Europe was post-World War II, where the European landscape had been turned into a moonscape. It was just horrific. And the Holocaust, the incredible loss of life, the sense of the utter meaninglessness of all of this was just in the European psyche, We didn't have that experience in World War II as Americans, because we were the good guys, and we went over, and we were heroic, and we came home with a sense of accomplishment. We beat the Nazis, and we came back to a hero's welcome, and the whole flavor of existentialism here was therefore more optimistic, or at least more upbeat. In Europe, it was dark, very, very dark. But it came to America post-World War II, early 50s, with a bunch of weird people called beatniks. Yeah, Mr. Ingard. Not really. The beatniks, kind of the Greenwich Village bunch in Manhattan, who became very popular in American culture, but they didn't have a widespread popular expression, but they were kind of well known. You remember the show Dobie Gillis?
That's what I'm thinking.
That's right. And what was the guy's name who was the popularizer of the beatniks in Dobie Gillis? His name was? He later played Gilligan's Island. Well, in the show, I don't remember his name either, but in the show, the name was Maynard G. Krebs. That's right. Yeah, I can't think of what his actual name. From there, from the kind of beat generation, it moved to, in the early 60s, the surfers. The Beach Boys were the popularizers of the existential culture. Life is a beach. It's a party. Meaning is just catching the next wave and riding it into infinity. Surf's up, that's all that matters. No jobs. No worries. You just live there on the beach. From the
Gore,
what?
anarchy over in this row here.
These guys, I've despaired of them anyway.
You spelled surfers wrong.
It is right. Yeah, you're right.
They're murmuring.
Yeah, that's right. From there we go to the hippies. By now it's reaching more deeply. The tentacles of this are getting much more pervasive in our culture. Tim Leary famously said, kind of the great high priest of the hippie drug culture. Do you remember this expression, Tim Leary?
Yeah, I remember him.
Yeah. Tune in.
Or tune out.
No, tune in.
Oh, just
Tune in.
Tune in.
Turn on. Drop out. Tune in to what's really going on. Not the establishment, not the great, buildings that they're expression of our culture. Turn on, drop acid, drop out. Become a hippie. let your mind expand, psychedelic. That's what that means, to be mind expand. That was the existential impulse again, reaching even more. The whole drug culture, rise of Eastern religion, all of that really represents the popular expression of it. My timing is slightly off because I wanted to finish this class period by playing Simon and Garfunkel's Immortal. Do you know what I was going to play, Simon and Garfunkel? No, that's Sound of Silence. Probably one of the greatest celebrations of existentialism in our culture. The sound of silence, because we're all alone. We're all alone. But I'm going to have to save that. Stephen, go ahead.
I was just wondering, what would an existential opinion of morality be if they had any opinion whatsoever?
Morality is whatever you believe it should be for you, but whatever it is for you, you are ultimately responsible for it. This was Sartre's argument against the guys at the Nuremberg trials. He was part of the French underground, Second World War, the Nazi occupation. He was harsh on these guys who said, well, hey, I was just following orders when I was throwing these Jewish people into these ovens. I was just following orders. And Sartre said, no, when you did that became your war. And so he has a heavy view of morality, but it's your morality. There's nobody else, nowhere else you get it. But what you decide becomes your morality, and you are ultimately responsible for it. It's an important theme in Sartre that we're going to come back to when we start reading The Flies, which will start soon. We'll see that played out. But, thank you all. Arrivederci.